"Can I clean your barn for a food?" But when the Truggling rancher saw her, he stopped cold. Northern Wyoming, winter of 1882. Eli Morgan stepped out of his old barn, breath turning white in the morning frost. He was headed to water the livestock when he saw her. A woman on her knees at the edge of his gate, blanketed in snow, clutching a boy no older than 5. She looked up, eyes hollow. "Can I clean your barn for a plate of food?" Her voice cracked like brittle wood. But Eli's gaze had already dropped to the medallion hanging from her neck, round, tarnished, strung with braided leather. An exact copy of the one Daniel Harper had worn into battle. Eli stopped cold. His stomach turned. Snow fell in silence, but inside him, something screamed. A memory of cannon smoke, of Daniel falling face first in the mud. No one else had that medallion. Not unless they'd known Daniel Harper. Not unless they'd buried him. Eli Morgan hadn't spoken to another soul in over 3 months. He had no reason to. Not since the war. Not since the day his best friend died screaming in a trench that smelled of blood and winter and rot. His cabin stood like a scar on the prairie, lashed by wind and silence. Each morning, he rose before dawn, strapped on the prosthetic arm he'd carved himself, and moved through a routine that never changed. Feed the livestock, patch the fence, boil coffee, forget to drink it. Neighbors stopped coming by long ago. Letters from town went unread. Even God, once whispered to in midnight prayers, had become a stranger. Eli had learned to live without answers, without comfort. He slept in a cot beneath a cracked window and kept his rifle by the door. Not because he expected trouble, but because life taught him to. The war had taken his right arm, but worse, it had taken Daniel. And Eli never forgave himself. Daniel had been the good one. The one who wrote poetry in the margins of ration logs and sent money home to a woman named Grace. The one who stepped into fire to save the wounded, until one day he didn't step back. Eli had watched him fall, had tried to reach him, but mud, smoke, and the sudden screaming of retreat orders stopped him. When they carried the body back, Daniel's medallion was gone. They never found it. Eli had looked for it. For days. For something to bring back to Grace. But the field had swallowed it. And now, 15 years later, it hung from the neck of a starving woman on his land. Eli sat on the barn steps, heart pounding like hooves. He hadn't let the past touch him in years. He didn't want it now. But the cold wasn't what chilled him. It was the feeling that everything he'd buried was crawling out of the earth and knocking on his door. The woman hadn't moved from the gate. Snow gathered on her shoulders and clung to the edges of the child's blanket. The boy, barely more than a bundle of bones, stared up at Eli with wide, unblinking eyes, not crying, not speaking, just watching. Eli stepped forward, slowly. His boots crunched through the crusted snow. When he reached the fence, he could see her shivering, not from fear, but from the cold that came for the bones. Her lips were split, cheeks sunburnt despite the cold. She tried to rise, but her legs gave way. The boy clutched at her sleeve. Eli opened the gate without a word. "Get up," he said, his voice dry from disuse. "Come inside." The woman hesitated. "We can work, I swear. We don't want charity." Eli didn't answer. He turned and walked toward the cabin, leaving the gate open behind him. After a few breaths, he heard the snow crunch again. She followed. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and old pine. Eli fed the stove with dry kindling and set a dented pot over the flame. He broke a hard loaf of bread in half and laid one piece on a tin plate. The boy sat on the edge of the bed, eyes locked on the food but unmoving, as though he didn't trust the moment. The woman, Grace, she would later say, kept the blanket drawn over his shoulders. Eli poured water into a basin, set it beside the fire, and stepped back. She understood. She unwrapped the boy's feet first. Purple, cracked, toe looked black. She didn't cry, just dipped a rag in the warm water and pressed it gently to his skin. "He's not mine," she said quietly. He's his." Eli didn't look up. He poured coffee into a tin cup and sat on the edge of the table. "Whose?" She hesitated. Daniel's. That's what I told him. But it's not true. Eli looked at her then. Really looked. Her face was thinner than he remembered, but the eyes were the same. I was with Daniel. But before the war, before he left, we both knew it. The truth came like a long exhale. The boy's yours, Eli. He felt the words like a blow to the chest. She watched him carefully, expecting rejection or rage. But Eli said nothing. He stared into the fire, fingers tightening around the coffee cup. I didn't come here to ruin what you've built, she said. I wouldn't have come at all, but Daniel left a letter. He told me if anything ever happened, if things got dangerous. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle. He wrote, if she comes, keep her safe. Eli didn't take the letter. He didn't need to. The voice of Daniel Harper echoed in every syllable. They sat in silence, the fire cracking softly. Grace tucked the boy into a wool blanket and rubbed his hands until color returned. I've been running for weeks, she said. From Canyon Rock. The law there. It's not law anymore. It's something else. Eli looked up. Maddox. She nodded. Sheriff Clint Maddox. The man who had once ridden beside Daniel and Eli, who signed the execution order that sent Daniel to the gallows. A man with too many secrets and not enough conscience. He found out, she said. Found out Daniel was helping families cross into safety. He called it treason. But really, Daniel was just doing the right thing, Eli finished. Grace nodded. Now Maddox knows I'm back. I saw his men on the trail. If we hadn't hidden in that boxcar, we wouldn't have made it this far. She looked around the small room. At the cracked table, the warped floorboards, the rifle on the wall. I didn't know if you'd be here, or if you'd send us away. Eli stood. He crossed the room to the door and looked out into the snowfall. For years, the wind had been his only companion. The silence, his only safety. But something stirred now. The boy, Grace, Daniel's voice in that letter. He couldn't bury this one. Couldn't walk away. She hadn't come for charity. She'd come home. And deep down, Eli knew. This child, pale, thin, wrapped in an army blanket and half-frozen, was the last living piece of Daniel. And maybe the last piece of Eli, too. He turned to Grace. What's his name? She smiled faintly, as if the answer alone brought warmth. Theo, she said. Short for Theophilus. Daniel picked it from the Bible. Eli blinked hard, then nodded. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, the past had opened its eyes again. And this time, Eli didn't turn away. Eli Morgan stood in the doorway long after Grace and Theo had crossed into his cabin. The wind pushed against the walls, howling like a creature denied entry. Snowflakes caught in the folds of his coat, melted, and ran in slow rivulets down the seam of his collar. He watched the plains fade into white, then shut the door. Inside, silence. Grace knelt by the fire. She was unwinding strips of cloth from Theo's legs. Eli moved without thought, adding logs to the stove, setting the kettle to boil, breaking a loaf of bread hardened by weeks of dry air. The plate was dented, the bread stale. But it was food. It was warmth. He set the tin down near her, then reached for the basin he used for shaving. Water. Clean rags. He laid them out without speaking. Theo's feet were worse than he thought. Purple around the toes, the skin split and raw. Grace dipped a cloth in the warm basin and began cleaning them, her hands shaking only slightly. He hasn't walked since yesterday morning, she said softly. He didn't complain, just looked at me and kept holding my hand. Eli crouched down to check the damage and the boy tensed. But he didn't pull away. His eyes, green and wary, locked on Eli's. A mirror almost. A strange, silent recognition passed between them. He's strong, Eli murmured. Grace nodded. Stronger than me. She rinsed the cloth again and turned back to the child, who leaned against her shoulder, limp with exhaustion. I lied to Daniel, she said after a long pause. Not about the boy, about the letter. I didn't tell him I planned to come here someday. Eli stood and poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one, then sat on the stool across the fire. He knew. Grace blinked. What? Eli sipped from his cup. He knew you'd come. One way or another. That's why he wrote that line. If she comes. He knew you'd run out of places. And that this one would still be standing. Grace stared at the fire. He wrote you, too. Didn't he? Eli nodded slowly. A month before the hanging. I never opened it. Just couldn't. Do you still have it? I do. Silence again. Not cold, not sharp. Just full. Then she whispered, I was afraid you'd hate me. I did, Eli said. Once. Grace looked up, startled. But it passed, he continued. A long time ago, when I saw him dying in front of me, none of that mattered. I would have given anything to trade places with him. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She folded the cloth and set it aside. He died for kindness. That's what they called treason. Helping people cross a line drawn on a map. He always said maps were made by men who never bled. Eli stood and walked to the cabinet by the hearth. He opened it and pulled out a folded wool coat. Small, dusty, patched in 2 places. I was going to send this, after the war, but I didn't know where. He knelt and held it open. Theo. The boy blinked, uncertain. Arms, Eli said. The child reached forward. The sleeves were a little long, but the coat fit. Eli buttoned the top, careful of the bruising on his chest. Then he stood, turned to Grace. He can sleep in the bedroom. I'll take the floor. You don't have to. I do. No more was said. That night, Theo curled on Eli's bed beneath a patchwork quilt stitched by a woman long dead. Grace slept by the fire, half watching, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Eli lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling beams, listening. Somewhere in the dark, the land shifted. Not in the soil, not in the snow, but in him. Something thawed. Morning came quietly. Snow still fell, but gentler now. A hush lay over the ranch, the kind of hush that follows a decision made deep in the bones. Eli went out to the barn early. The animals stirred at his approach, but not alarmed. He fed them slowly, methodically, milked the cow, checked the nails in the back gate. When he returned to the house, Grace was cooking something over the fire, beans, rehydrated with water and a little lard. She had found his tin of spices and used just enough cumin to give the room a scent that reminded Eli of late autumns long gone. I hope you don't mind, she said. Theo's still sleeping. I don't mind. He sat, watching her stir the pot with a wooden spoon worn smooth. You were always good with scraps, he said. She smiled faintly. Learned early. Mama taught me never to waste a thing. Even bad days. They ate in silence. Then Grace reached into her satchel and pulled out the medallion. She held it out. He gave this to me before he left. Said if I ever needed a miracle, this would lead me to one. Eli stared at it. Tarnished, yes, but the pattern was still clear. 2 hands joined, etched into silver, surrounded by stars. A token they had both carried in the war. Daniel's was supposed to be buried with him. You gave it to him, Grace said. Didn't you? Eli nodded. After the raid on Red Hill, he saved my life. Twice. I wore it every day since he left, she said. I think that's why they spared me. When they took him, when Maddox's men came, I think one of them saw the medal and hesitated. You shouldn't wear it now, Eli said. If Maddox sees it again. Grace's hand curled over the silver. He already has. Eli looked at her, sharp. What do you mean? I passed through Canyon Rock before I came here. Just long enough to buy medicine. One of Maddox's deputies saw me. I saw the look in his eyes. He'll tell Maddox. Eli rose and paced. That was 2 days ago? 3. Maybe less. He went to the window. The plains stretched out, quiet, but he knew that silence could shatter fast. I have an old root cellar, he said. From back when my father ran whiskey through these hills. Hidden under the woodshed. Grace stood. We can't ask you to hide us. You didn't. I'm offering. She stepped closer. Eli. but he held up a hand. "You're not just someone from my past. You're Daniel's family, and the boy is mine. That makes this my fight now." Grace looked at him, long and deep, then nodded. That evening, Eli cleaned his rifle for the first time in years. Grace wrapped Theo's foot and read aloud from Daniel's letter again, as if his voice could carry them through whatever was coming. And outside, over the ridge, a thin column of smoke rose. Not theirs. Someone else was coming. Someone who had already lit a fire. It began with smoke. A thin column, rising like a warning into the darkening sky. Not from Eli's chimney, but from the ridge to the south, where no one should have been. Eli saw it while splitting wood for the stove. He lowered the axe and stared until the wind shifted and the trail vanished. A ghost signal. A hunter's fire. Or worse. Inside, Grace was teaching Theo how to wrap his foot with the cloth Eli had boiled clean. She smiled faintly at the boy's clumsy fingers, but her eyes flicked to the door as soon as it opened. Eli stepped in, face unreadable. "Start packing." Grace stood. "What is it?" "Someone's nearby. Too close." She glanced out the window, her hand instinctively moving to Theo's shoulder. Maddox. Could be. She didn't argue. She began collecting what little they had, blankets, dried food, the letter. Eli grabbed the rifle from its place above the hearth, checked the chamber, and slung it over his shoulder. Theo watched it all silently. "Is it the bad men?" Eli knelt beside him. "It might be, but we're going to hide somewhere safe." "The root cellar?" Eli blinked. "How'd you know about that?" Theo smiled, shy. "I saw the door behind the shed. It was covered in snow, but I saw you shovel it out." Eli gave a quick nod. "Smart boy." 10 minutes later, they were underground. The old root cellar smelled of damp earth and forgotten whiskey. Barrels lined the walls, and a patch of melted snow marked where Eli had cleared the entrance. He lit a lantern and handed it to Grace, then pulled a thick slab of wood across the opening. Inside the cabin, he left the fire burning. Bread on the table. A kettle just starting to boil. Let it look lived in. Let it look empty. Then he waited. He sat by the window with the rifle across his knees and watched the horizon as night came. It wasn't long. By full dark, the hooves came. First a single rider, then 3 more. They didn't speak. Didn't knock. They simply circled the house once, then again, then dismounted. Eli recognized the silhouette of the leader immediately, tall, broad-shouldered, and slow-moving with authority that didn't need to speak. Clint Maddox, sheriff of Canyon Rock. And once, 15 years ago, a man who shared rations and whiskey with Daniel Harper. Maddox hadn't aged well. His hair had gone to iron, and the scar on his cheek, gift from a southern saber, was deeper than Eli remembered. The sheriff stood at Eli's porch and sniffed the air. "You in there, Morgan?" Eli didn't answer. "Didn't expect you to be. Place looks too damn tidy." Maddox chuckled to himself. "But I'll ask anyway. Seen a woman and a boy come through?" Still, Eli said nothing. Maddox stepped up to the door. "Her name's Grace. She was Harper's. The boy's name is... don't know. Don't much care." He paused. "She's wanted. For harboring a fugitive. For aiding treason. And the boy, well, might be his, might be yours. Doesn't matter. Law says they're to be brought in." Eli's knuckles whitened on the rifle. "I'm giving you a chance, Eli," Maddox said. "Step aside. Let us take them. No one gets hurt." Eli rose and crossed the room slowly. He looked through the thin curtain at the men. For total. All armed. Then he lifted the rifle and fired into the air. The men ducked. Horses reared. Maddox cursed and took cover behind the trough. Inside the root cellar, Grace flinched. Theo grabbed her hand. Eli shouted out the window, voice cold as the wind. "You come near this house again, I won't miss." Maddox's voice snapped back. "So that's how it is. You're protecting her. After all these years." Eli didn't answer. "Then you just bought yourself a fire." The torches came next. One was thrown against the barn. Another against the side wall of the cabin. Dry winter would caught quick. Flames licking up the siding like eager tongues. Eli moved fast. He dropped through the trapdoor into the cellar, smoke already curling in behind him. Grace gasped. What? They lit it. Theo clung to her. Mama, it's burning. Eli pulled the trap closed behind him and sealed it with the inner latch. The cellar air was thick, but cooler. They won't stay long, he said. They'll think we're gone. Grace's voice trembled. You shouldn't burn for me. Eli looked at her. I already burned, he said. Now I'm building something from the ashes. They huddled in silence. The roar of fire above them muffled but alive. The boy's breathing grew rapid, shallow. Eli handed him a cloth to press over his nose. Eventually the sounds faded. The riders left with nothing. No bodies, no prisoners, just smoke and ash. Eli didn't move until dawn. When they emerged, the house was gutted. The roof had collapsed. The barn was half gone. But the land was still there. And so were they. Grace walked through the blackened doorway, holding Theo close. Tears streaked her soot-covered cheeks, but her spine stayed straight. Eli stared at what was left, and then he turned. We'll go to the courthouse, he said. We'll tell them everything. Grace blinked. You think they'll believe us? They won't have a choice. The town of Canyon Rock hadn't seen this many people packed into the courthouse since the rail contracts were signed a decade ago. Now they came not for gold or promise, but for truth, and vengeance, and perhaps something finer, redemption. Eli Morgan stood near the front, coat still singed from the fire, face shadowed by wear. Grace stood beside him, hair braided tight, hands trembling only slightly. Theo sat between them, clutching Daniel's letter in both hands. Across the room, Sheriff Clint Maddox leaned back in his chair like a man still certain of his power. Judge Ames called the room to order. This hearing is now in session. State your claim. Grace stepped forward. Her voice cracked at first, then grew steadier as she held up the worn letter. This was written by Daniel Harper before his execution, she said. In it, he confesses to helping poor families cross the border to safety. He names Sheriff Maddox as the one who called him a traitor. Not for the law, but for money. She unfolded the page and began to read. If she comes, keep her safe. Tell the truth. The sheriff took a bribe to call kindness treason. I helped families, not enemies. I never regretted it. If they kill me, let it be known. The rope was paid for. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Maddox stood abruptly. That letter could have been forged. The woman disappeared for years. She's no citizen of this town. Eli stepped forward, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. I was there when Daniel died, he said, voice calm. I saw the shame in his eyes, and the fear, not of death, of being erased. This letter is real. So is the locket she wears. So is the child you tried to silence. He looked to the judge. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because Daniel asked me to protect them. That starts with telling the truth. Judge Ames leaned forward. And the boy? Eli turned to Theo, who looked up at him with wide eyes. He's my son, Eli said. Not Daniel's. But Daniel protected him anyway, because that's who he was. A murmur spread through the crowd. Maddox laughed, bitter and sharp. You think that changes anything? A bastard child, a grieving woman, and an old soldier? That's your proof. Suddenly, two men stood from the back. One held a ledger, the other a badge. We were deputies once, the first said. Maddox told us to rewrite reports, to label Daniel's work as treason. We kept a record. It's all here. The ledger was passed to the judge. Pages of names, dates, payouts, witnesses. It was more than enough. Maddox's face turned red. You traitorous little worms. Silence, the judge commanded. I've heard enough. He looked down at the ledger, then back to the room. Clint Maddox, this court finds you guilty of conspiracy, falsifying legal records, and wrongful execution. You will be removed from your post and held until your sentence is carried out. Maddox's hands clenched into fists. He stood, glaring at Grace. You think you've won? You've shamed a lawman in front of this town. For what? A dead man scribbles. Grace didn't respond, but Eli did. He stepped forward, voice low but steady. When that rope tightens, it won't be justice's hand you feel. It'll be the voices you silenced. The ones you tried to bury under lies. The gavel struck. The sentence was set. And for the first time in years, Eli Morgan felt the weight of silence shift. Not disappear, but change. Spring came late to the high plains of northern Wyoming. Snow still clung to the shady folds of the hills, reluctant to melt after such a hard winter. But the sun was warmer now, and the wind softer. Less like a knife, more like a whisper. Where the fire had scorched the ground black, tufts of green began to push through, as if the land itself refused to stay broken. On that high ridge where Eli Morgan's home once stood, the charred timbers had been cleared. New beams were rising. Sturdy pine brought in from the north woods, cut and hauled by hand, one at a time. Eli worked every morning at sunrise, steady and silent. He drove nails with precision, guided by the strength of his left hand and the care of his prosthetic right. Each strike of the hammer was both repentance and resolve. He said little as he worked, but each board he raised was a promise. To Daniel, to Grace, to Theo, and maybe, finally, to himself. Grace worked too. She tended the cook fire, boiled water, cleaned salvaged pans with salt and snowmelt. When Theo's foot healed, she wrapped his hands in cloth and let him help. She planted herbs in old crates beside the steps, sage, rosemary, and sweet mint, and she sang when she thought no one could hear her. Theo changed fastest. His limp disappeared within weeks. The color returned to his cheeks. He grew bold, curious, stubborn. He followed Eli around like a calf after its mother, asking questions, carrying tools, fetching water with proud determination. They named the place together, the Warm Hearth Inn. It wasn't much at first. A two-room lodge, with stove at the center, a wide porch facing west. But it stood strong. Eli carved a sign from red cedar and hung it above the door, sealing it with a coat of pine tar. Above that, nailed into the beam, hung Daniel's medallion, the same one Grace had worn that first day, now polished and fixed between two hand-forged nails. Travelers soon found their way. A ranch hand passing through. A mother and daughter heading west to Fort Laramie. A trapper with frostbitten toes and stories of wolves in the hills. They stayed for a night or sometimes two. Grace made stew. Eli offered shelter. Theo listened to every story like it was gospel. The townsfolk of Canyon Rock came too, quiet at first. A few brought firewood. One left a sack of flour. Others simply nodded and tipped their hats, unsure how to apologize without saying the words. But Eli didn't need apologies. He saw the ledger. He heard the verdict. And in the quiet eyes of those who came, he found something that almost resembled peace. He never spoke of Maddox again. Never said the sheriff's name. Never mentioned the fire or the trial. But the town remembered. They all remembered. And that was enough. In the evenings, when supper was done and the guests asleep, Eli would sit on the porch. The wind would ease down the hill like a slow hymn, carrying the scent of cut pine and cooked beans. He'd lean back in the rocking chair Theo had helped him build and stare at the prairie, vast, gold-tipped, endless. Grace would sometimes sit beside him, sewing or sipping coffee. Sometimes she'd rest her head on his shoulder. Sometimes she'd just watch the horizon in silence. And Theo, he ran barefoot through the tall grass chasing fireflies. He'd laugh when they blinked away, then laugh again when he caught one in his hands and held it like a secret lantern. One night, as the stars came out and the fireflies lit the yard like small floating candles, Eli spoke. "I thought I lost everything when I lost my arm. And when Daniel died." Grace turned to him, brushing a thread of hair from her cheek. "You didn't." He nodded slowly. "I know that now. I lost a brother, but I found a son. And a family." She smiled. "I asked for food." He chuckled, voice warm in the cool night air. "And I gave you work." "No," she said gently. "You gave us life." They sat together, the quiet folding in around them. Theo ran up to the porch, firefly cupped in his hands, and held it out. "Look, Mama, Papa." He's still glowing. Eli froze at the word, just for a second. But Grace didn't correct it. She simply reached for the boy's hand and kissed his forehead. Eli looked at them both. This woman who once stood on his doorstep like a ghost, and this child who was flesh of his flesh, born from a past he had tried to bury. And he felt something settle in him. Not regret, not shame, something lighter, hope. He placed his hand gently on Theo's head. "Let it go, son," he said softly. "Let it fly." Theo opened his fingers. The firefly rose into the night and vanished into the stars. And for the first time in years, Eli Morgan didn't feel like a man surviving. He felt like a man living.